Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Sea Realm Podcast. I am your host, KMO, and this is episode number 253, Grasp the Nettle, prepared for release onto the World Wide Web on Wednesday, April 13th, 2011. If you live in the United States and you're the kind of person who pays federal income tax, better get on it if it's not done already, or you'll be in trouble. The guest this week is Neil Kramer. Neil Kramer is a repeat guest on the program. He is a longtime favorite of many listeners, including Mariah C. And Mariah C., it is entirely due to you that Neil is appearing on this week's episode of the Sea Realm Podcast. He and I correspond fairly regularly, and there's always the notion of, we'll get you back on the podcast sooner or later, and it is Mariah C.'s intervention that led to sooner rather than later. So thank you to Mariah C., and also to Simon T., Richard B., Carl J., and Frank G. Those are the sponsors of this week's episode of the Sea Realm Podcast. Thanks also to the $3 a month subscribers. I don't read your names out on the podcast, but I do see them in my email, and I am very conscious of who you are and what you do for the Sea Realm Podcast. So thank you very much to everybody. So for those of you who are not particularly interested in how Neil's message dovetails with the larger project of the Sea Realm Podcast, go ahead and jump ahead to about the 10-minute mark. That's when things with Neil get rolling. But for the next few minutes, I want to read a few things and talk a little bit about narratives and how the various narratives that I deal with here on the Sea Realm Podcast sort of coalesce in what you're about to hear. Eric Boyd, another repeat guest on the podcast and somebody who has been a pretty prominent figure in the early episodes of 2011, he and I have an ongoing email correspondence, and we talk about a lot of the issues that I talk about here on the Sea Realm Podcast, and Eric is very much of the opinion that things are going well. In fact, he thinks of himself as a rational optimist and is not a devotee, but certainly enthusiastic for the work of Matt Ridley, who wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. And so there is the very optimistic narrative that you hear sometimes here on the Sea Realm Podcast as it relates to technology and whatnot. There is the doomer narrative, or the narrative of sudden industrial collapse, and that one gets a lot of play just because it really seems to be happening right now. There are other narratives as well, and, well, let me read something that Paul Kingsnorth posted on the Dark Mountain website about narratives. This is in an essay called The Quants and the Poets, quants being folks who are really keen for quantitative analysis, numbers, formula, that sort of thing. Paul Kingsnorth writes, "The mess that the Greens have gotten themselves into is at least partly due to them paying more attention to numbers than narratives. Green political thought in its early incarnations was radical and challenging. It was about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, stories about progress, industry, the conquest of nature, and many other narratives that the Dark Mountain Project exists to highlight. The early Greens challenged these stories with others, drawn in some cases from ecotopian imaginings about a better future, but in many more cases from the stories of existing non-industrial societies. The Kalahari Bushmen, for example, who lived for 35,000 years in a culture which managed to survive in remarkable harmony with non-human nature, even with lions prowling outside the huts of its people. You want sustainability? The Bushmen were the longest recorded human culture. They were genuinely sustainable for longer than we can imagine. Industrial society got them in the end, like it gets everything, but the example remains. This kind of thing, of course, was what made it so easy to attack the Greens as romantics and primitivists, which some of them were and still are. In response, environmentalists decided to get serious, so as to be listened to in the corridors of power. They started wearing suits and pretending to be economists and speaking the language of business and science. It was a perfectly sensible approach in many ways, and it yielded many clear dividends. But it may also have doomed the Greens in the longer term, for now they find themselves caught in a narrative of other people's making. Almost by accident, mainstream Green politics and argument threw out most of the alternative stories it grew up with, like a child throws out his old teddy bears. That was then, but this is now. We are now grown-ups. This approach has left environmentalism in a position where its advocates now find themselves unable to do anything but argue about which machines they would prefer to use to power an ever-growing industrial economy. Any sally outside this tightly controlled ghetto sees them rained with bullets from all sides, accused of wishful thinking if they talk about zero-growth economies, called snobs and hypocrites if they criticize consumerism, attacked as terrorists if they engage in direct action to protect wild nature, called naive idealists if they ask whether planning for a future much like the present is really such a good idea. This has always been the case, of course, but now that the Greens are being heard in the corridors of power, the stakes are much higher. A global anti-green movement now exists and is growing in power and influence. Meanwhile, the Greens have been taken over from within by smooth-tongued purveyors of business as usual without the carbon. The message is clear. Stick to arguing about machines and you're welcome to play with the big boys. But drop all the other nonsense, all right? This, demonstrably, is how radical movements die. So that was Paul Kingsnorth writing on dark-mountain.net, and Eric, in an email that he sent to me, made reference to this, and in fact he quoted the last half of the last paragraph, in which Paul Kingsnorth writes, "The quants and the poets are both needed, but I would argue that right now the poets ought to take the lead, if indeed that is ever something poets are capable of. We have no shortage of arguments about numbers and machines, but we do have a great shortage of workable stories. That is to say, stories that don't just have happy endings, but have convincing plots as well." And from this, Eric continued. One of the things that was interesting about Ishmael, for me, was precisely that Daniel Quinn focused on stories very explicitly. And he teased out both the story of the takers, us, and the story of the leavers, those whose culture we have been displacing for over 5,000 years, yet I was left unsatisfied with the story of the leavers. It had a certain internal cogency, but I feel it really lacked any compelling reason for any particular individual to participate in the story. In short, it had a happy ending, but lacked a convincing plot. I still recommend the book, though, and while I'm recommending books, I want to repeat my recommendation for The Rebel Cell. I think it attacks some of the very roots of the Sea Realm in a way that I've never seen before, so I think you'd find it a challenging read, and hopefully, therefore, an exciting read. And I did go and start reading that collection of excerpts, and I got to something that really kind of irritated me. The authors of The Rebel Cell wrote, "Fight Club is entirely orthodox in its Rousseauian rejection of modern order. Less orthodox is its proffered solution, which, in the middle and final acts, moves swiftly from Iron John to the Trenchcoat Mafia." Now, the Trenchcoat Mafia was a group of kids at Columbine High School, and Klebold and Harris, the two sad individuals who shot up that school, got classified by the bullies who picked on them as being members of the Trenchcoat Mafia, which in fact they were not. This comparison really irritated me because I really, really like the movie Fight Club. I think it is an important narrative in my own mental landscape. And I wrote back to Eric to say that Harris and Klebold were powerless individuals, and ultimately their shooting spree, while it took out a few humans who were nearly as powerless as they themselves, proved completely ineffectual and highlighted their powerlessness. Tyler Durden, on the other hand, the mythical protagonist in Fight Club, he and his troops scored a bigger and more effective hit against corporate power than any real-life example in history. The Project Mayhem crew in Fight Club directed their violence exclusively at corporations and took extreme care to make sure that no humans who didn't volunteer were harmed in their campaign against corporate debt peddlers. The Rebel Cell authors are either demonstrating that they missed the point of Fight Club or that they have no intention of playing fair. In either case, they propel themselves way down the ranks of my to-read pile with that comment. And I closed by writing to Eric saying, I would be interested in reading your summation of what you took to be the value in their material, as I imagine it would prove far more persuasive than Heath and Potter's actual words, Heath and Potter being the authors of The Rebel Cell.